Happy New Year, students, and welcome to our second semester in biology. When we left off before Christmas time, we finished up Unit 5. And Unit 5, just to briefly remind you, was about Gregor Mendel. And Gregor Mendel is the father of modern genetics. He really studied heredity, studied all those physical traits. Remember, he linked back to pea pods. And we did a whole lot of things with things called Punnett squares, where we could make predictions about offspring and what kind of physical traits or characteristics they would have. In this unit, Unit 6, it's going to be fairly short. We're only going to take a couple weeks to go through it. I like to entitle it Extending Mendelian Genetics. In other words, we're going off of what we've already learned. So we're going to see a lot of the same things, but then we're also going to see some points that are a little bit different. So let's just look and kind of remind ourselves about a few things. You'll need to go through your student notes as we progress through this slideshow, and make sure you fill in the blanks there so you'll have them for quizzes and exams and all that kind of good stuff. So just to kind of remind you, looking at chromosomes and phenotype, remember that's what you can physically see about an organism. An organism has 2 copies of each autosomal gene that affects a phenotype. Remember, an autosomal gene is 22 of those 23 pairs that humans have. The autosomes are the ones not related to sex, not related to male or female. Okay, so these are the things that give us the physical characteristics of all other things. So we have 2 copies, one from mom, one from dad. And most human traits are the result of autosomal genes. Of course, we're going to look at throughout this chapter some that maybe not, maybe are sex-linked or related to those other pair, that sex pair. So let's look at this by looking at human genetic disorders. Now, most genetic disorders are disorders that you are born with. You don't develop because of some accident or injury or anything like that. You are born genetically with these disorders. Most of them are caused by autosomal genes. Okay, autosomal genes. So they're not related to those sex genes. They're on the other 22 pair. Now, the chance of having a disorder can be predicted. As we learn in our modern world, about our genetics, we can get DNA samples and things like that. 23andMe and Ancestry and all that kind of stuff. You might have seen commercials. They tell you, hey, what's the chance that you might have this type of disorder? This is that same principle. Okay, they can, by looking at the autosomal genes, you can predict whether you're going to have a genetic disorder or not. What likelihood, if you're 75% chance likely to have it or not, based on your DNA that you got from mom and dad. These use the same principles Mendel did. Okay, so we're not branching out too far yet. Now, when we look at disorders, we call them either recessive disorders or dominant disorders. Some disorders are caused by the recessive alleles on autosomes. Okay, this is actually most of them. So let's just look at this Punnett square that we have here. Remember, recessive doesn't mean it's weaker, doesn't mean anything like that. It just simply means if the dominant, signified by a capital letter, and the recessive, signified by a lowercase letter, are in that allele pair, the dominant ones is going to be seen. All right, so the disorder in this case, recessive allele disorders, are carried on that recessive trait. So look at this. This parent has a dominant, means it does not have the disorder, and then has a recessive. So this one would be kind of blotted out or overshadowed by the dominant. Same case here. We put the Punnett square, bring it down, bring it over, bring it down, bring it over, all that good stuff. We can see that this person would have a 25% chance of having the disorder because it is carried on that recessive allele. That's what we're worried about when we talk about a recessive allele disorder. All right? It just simply means that they got to have 2 copies of the recessive allele to have the disorder, just like we saw in that Punnett square a minute ago. Now, these disorders often appear in the offspring of parents who are heterozygous. Just looking back, remember, heterozygous means that allele pairing is different. Hetero means different. Homo means the same. So heterozygous parents, here we are. Neither one of them would have the disorder because there's a recessive allele disorder and the dominant blots it out, but there would be a 25% chance of them having it. Cystic fibrosis is a very good example of a recessive allele disorder. This is just simply, to briefly tell you about it. The sweat glands of a person, the mucus glands, you've all had mucus. You hock a loogie, that's mucus coming out of your respiratory system. Cystic fibrosis, this gets very thick. So the sweat glands are very thick. Their sweat may not look the same as ours, but more importantly, their mucus glands produce a whole lot more of their mucus, or it's very thickened. It sometimes can even become harder. Imagine trying to breathe with lots of loogies, filling up your airways. Okay, so cystic fibrosis is like that. But it's a recessive allele disorder. Now, you might have noticed something on that chart 2 pages ago. A person who is heterozygous, so they got big C, little c, right? Or they got one allele that's showing they don't have a disorder and one that they do, even though the dominant one would blur that out. This person is called a carrier. A carrier is simply somebody who does not show symptoms of a disease, but has the potential to pass it on to their offspring, okay? Like, for example, this person would be a non-carrier. They have no potential to pass it on to their offspring, and they do not show symptoms of it. A carrier is somebody who does not have the symptoms, okay? So it don't look like they have the disease. They do not have the disease, but they do have the potential to carry it, pass it on to their offspring, okay? Carrier is a super important term that you need to go ahead and lock away because we're going to be using it later on in this unit. So carrier, somebody that does not have a disease, but has the potential to pass it on because they have a heterozygous genotype. All right, so just as we got recessive allele disorders, we also have dominant allele disorders. These are far less common than recessive disorders. All right, and this simply means that the disorder is carried on the dominant allele. All right, so here we go. We're kind of switching up from what we just saw with the recessive allele. Instead of being on that little c, it would be on that big C. All right, just using those letters as a generic term. All right, a great example of this would be Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a nervous system disorder. It's where parts of the brain don't work as efficiently as they used to. It can also, you can see it physically. Their muscles won't work exactly the same. They're not able to express themselves emotionally with their facial muscles. So anyway, but it appears later on in life, usually during adulthood. If the parents are heterozygous, there's a 75% chance that their kids are going to have it. Now think about this. Because it is going back again, because it's a dominant allele disorder, it is found on the dominant trait. It's found on the dominant gene, okay? So the parent would have it, and they'd most likely pass it on to their offspring as well. But what it's saying here is if you set up a Punnett square with two heterozygous parents, both of them would have Huntington's disease, there's still a 25% chance that their children would not. All right? Since the disease strikes later in life, the person can have children before the disease appears. Now think about it. If you both, you and your partner both had Huntington's disease, you probably wouldn't want to have children because you know there would be a high chance that they would pass it on. Now you still might, and, you just go on with that. But what you normally see is people have children before Huntington's disease comes about, before you see it. So they most likely, 75% chance at least, pass it on to their offspring. All right. So we'll look at these a little more intently in class next week about recessive and dominant disorders. Okay, just setting up some Punnett squares with that, but I just wanted you to have the big meat of your notes. All right, so those were autosomal disorders. They are found on those autosomes, the 22 pairs, not related to sex. But then we also have something called sex-linked traits, and with that, sex-linked disorders. All right, so Mendel figured out everything that he did about heredity, but he didn't even know about chromosomes at that time. He had no clue that we had 23 pairs or however many a pea plant has. He didn't know anything about that. But it just so happened that he only studied autosomal traits, so those not found on the sex genes. So expression of genes on those sex chromosomes differ from autosomal genes. The biggest thing that we're going to see is there are actually some physical traits that can be found on the X or Y chromosome, those sex chromosomes, that have nothing to do with the sex, okay? So it's not just about male or female, okay? There are some other traits that can be found there. Remember, everything that we're really learning this unit is exceptions to the rules, okay? Just like with Mendel's things, that recessive and dominant. We'll see that there's some exceptions to the rules that we've learned about, especially in this next little section. But anyway, this is kind of going outside of what we've learned. We've learned that X and Y chromosomes only carry the sex. There's a little more to it than that, okay? That's what I want you to see. Now, genes located on the sex chromosomes are called sex-linked genes. Easy enough there. Many species have specialized sex chromosome, including humans. Individuals that are XX, so have that X chromosome and X chromosome as their pair, are female, and XY, as we've already learned, are male. Now, one thing to note here, X chromosomes are much larger than the Y. So there's much more genetic material carried on those X chromosomes that if you're a guy, you got the X from mom. If you're a female, you got it either from mom or dad. Okay, so the X chromosome is much larger than the Y. All right, so let's think about males here. Males only have one copy of each chromosome, X and Y. As we see in this Punnett square here, here's the two males, offspring. It gets the Y from dad. That's what makes it a male. And then it gets the X from mom because that's all she has to pass on. She's going to pass on an X. Okay? So with the male, expresses all alleles on each chromosome. Anything it got from X, that's the only option there. Anything it got from Y, that's the only option there. There's no second copy of an X, like say females would have XX. There's a second copy that might mask some of the effects of that allele. All right, so you can think of it this way. All recessive alleles are going to be expressed in that male. There's no dominant one to cover it up. There's something, however, called a Y-linked gene, okay? And that's that there's very few genes found on that Y chromosome. It's much smaller, but there are a few, okay? There are a few. We call these polyandric genes. There's not many of them. One is hairy ears. So I think we saw it at the beginning of Unit 5. We saw a guy with these hairy ears, and both of his sons had it. Why did they have it? Because it's found on the Y. And that was the only thing. Their dad was the only one passing a Y chromosome on to the sons, so of course they're going to have it. Here's an interesting question. Is it possible for a female to inherit a polyandric trait? No, of course not, because a female is XX. So these polyandric traits, which are Y-linked, the female doesn't have any Y, so it's got to be on the dad. Okay, just looking ahead, sorry. Into the next slide, we're going to finish up right here. In each cell of a female, there's two chromosomes, right? Two X chromosomes, excuse me. One from mom, one from dad. There's something interesting that happens here. One of them is randomly turned off. This is called X chromosome inactivation, okay? What actually happens is it's not like our autosomal chromosomes where there might be a dominant trait on one and a recessive on the other, and the dominant will be seen over the recessive. What actually happens in females with these X chromosomes, they're just randomly turned off. One of them is completely inactivated, okay? What begins to happen, however, though, is look at these cats. This creates this patchwork of offspring. These are calico cats. If you've ever had them, you know they have interesting patterns on them, and these patterns are not easily predictable because you may have a mom that looks something like this. Then you may have a male. Of course, it's getting a X and a Y chromosome, so that Y might affect the physical phenotype, the looks of that male. But then you might have females that you would think would look exactly like mom because they're getting these X's, but they're also getting one from dad too. But you have things starting to be turned on and off. So in this female kitten, some of their X genes is just randomly inactivated. Okay, there is no predictable method with it. So here we see once again an exception to the rule. The rule always is dominant over recessive, right? Here we see when it comes to X chromosomes, with some genes, there's something called X chromosome inactivation. Okay. Sorry, I know I had to rush through this, but I do encourage you to maybe watch it twice as you fill in your student notes. Feel free to pause it as we you need to write some things down and fill it in. And we will certainly do question and answer time next week when we're back in person, hopefully, for y'all to ask any questions. If you have questions about this, feel free to email me and I will answer you back. Even if we need to sit down and have a video call, we can do that too. Okay. Hope everybody has a great week. Make sure you check all your other assignments.